Lord of Mysteries. My Identities echoes across time. Chapter 461 to 470. Russell was questioning his life at that moment. Clearly, despite being a Sequence 2 knowledge magister, Russell doubted whether his ears were deceiving him, or if he was already on the verge of losing control. Otherwise, how could he be hallucinating? However, what surprised Russell even more was that while he was doubting himself, the person who had just said something shocking suddenly changed his tone and said, "But before that, I need to check your soul first." "Check my soul? Why?" Russell's brows furrowed almost instinctively and looked at Lynn suspiciously, but unconsciously, his expression became more serious. "Although, in theory, you were only completely corrupted by the mother goddess of depravity after your travel to the moon, if I'm not mistaken, you may have already been initially corrupted by her power when you first landed on that unnamed island." Lynn calmly revealed something significant. "So, I've already been corrupted by the outer god." This. Russell's eyes widened. He wanted to refute Lynn, but thinking back to his experiences on that unnamed island and remembering the connection with Mr. Door after that, Lynn had already told him that Mr. Door was currently under the control of an outer god. The words of rebuttal got stuck in his throat. In the end, Russell couldn't help but scratch his head and ask Lynn with some confusion, "If I was indeed corrupted back then, what's the point of stopping my travel now?" "Of course, it's significant. I can't handle deep corruption, but if it's just shallow corruption." Lynn smiled brightly and said, "I can give it a try." Lynn wasn't lying. After discovering that Mr. Door had been corrupted as early as the fourth epoch and after interacting with the fully corrupted Russell, Lynn had been researching matters related to outer god corruption. As someone who wasn't short on samples, didn't fear corruption himself, and could even suppress the pollution from the mother goddess of depravity with his own spirituality, Lynn had made some progress in his relentless research. For cases like Bethel and Russell, who had ventured to the moon and were deeply, comprehensively corrupted, with their entire souls practically marinated in the power of outer gods, Lynn's current methods couldn't resolve that. But if it was just initial corruption, where the soul was tainted with a bit of the outer god's power or had a corresponding mark planted, Lynn already had a solution. Although he hadn't tested the method yet, the test subject was right in front of him. Lynn looked at Russell, his smile warm and radiant. Even if he failed, he could still use his time travel abilities to prevent Russell from going to that unnamed island in the first place. As for why Lynn didn't just descend at the point in time when Russell went to the island and solved the problem at its root, the reason was simple: changes to the past wouldn't cause a butterfly effect in the future. Whether or not Russell was initially corrupted on that unnamed island, his complete corruption and control by the mother goddess of depravity were inevitable after he traveled to the moon. So, even if Lynn descended at the time Russell visited the island and stopped him from going, it wouldn't directly change Russell's current state. Just like with Azek, they would have to wait for Lynn's avatar to reach that point in time on its own timeline before it could change Russell's condition in the present, or rely on time travel afterward. And compared to stopping Russell from traveling, preventing him from landing on the unnamed island was a much simpler task. Moreover, if Lynn's method for removing shallow corruption worked, descending at the time of Russell's ascension would be a one-and-done solution. So, how do we check? Russell hesitated for a few seconds, then gritted his teeth and asked. He didn't entirely believe Lynn's words, but he understood the situation. No matter what he believed, he wouldn't be able to resist Lynn's inspection of his soul, so he might as well cooperate. Besides, Russell was aware that he might have indeed encountered some secret corruption on that unnamed island. Just close your eyes. Don't worry, I'm very experienced with this kind of thing, Lynn said with a reassuring smile. Seeing that Russell had really closed his eyes, he adeptly switched into all-knowing, all-powerful mode and began inspecting Russell's soul. With this inspection, he did find an issue. Russell's soul had indeed been subjected to some secret corruption from the mother goddess of depravity. However, unlike Bethel's situation, perhaps because Russell hadn't wandered around in the cosmos, and the Earth's protective barrier was quite strong, the mother goddess of depravity's power that had infiltrated was limited. Russell's soul had only been slightly corrupted, with the corruption staying on the surface of his soul rather than penetrating deeply, leaving only a mark. Of course, the corruption of an outer god is tyrannical. Even a mere mark would be difficult to remove by anyone else. And as long as this mark remained, even if Rissel wasn't fully corrupted, the mother goddess of depravity would still be able to secretly influence him through the mark, guiding him to do certain things. In fact, Lynn strongly suspected that Rissel's sudden impulse to explore the moon wasn't entirely of his own volition, but the result of some hidden influence by an outer god. But it's your bad luck to have encountered me. Lynn chuckled. He pointed at Rissel's forehead, and the next second, overwhelming spirituality and terrifying knowledge surged into Rissel, though it didn't harm his soul. Instead, it enveloped the corruption from the mother goddess of depravity that had tainted Rissel's soul, and in the next moment, all that power exploded in an instant. Ah! Rissel instinctively clutched his head, staggering from the explosion's impact. Lynn withdrew his finger, observing the howling Rissel before him. With his all-knowing, all-powerful abilities, Lynn thoroughly scanned him multiple times before nodding in satisfaction. Thanks to his unique perspective from his true self, Lynn could confirm that the corruption on Rissel had been completely eradicated. From that moment onward, the mother goddess of depravity would no longer be able to influence him. As expected, my method worked. Lynn smiled. His inspiration for this method of removing corruption was partially derived from the glimpse his true self had taken back then. Though his true self hadn't entirely eradicated the corruption on Rissel at that time, it had indeed worn it down and even killed the personality created by the corruption. It was based on that insight that Lynn, after thorough research, developed the current method of removing corruption, essentially using his spirituality to suppress the corruption completely and then using knowledge from his true self to obliterate it. End of chapter. Welcome to Fanfic Audiobook, your go-to place for immersive audiobooks. If you enjoy the content, don't forget to like the video and subscribe to our channel for more amazing stories. As for where the knowledge from his true self came from, we have to thank Bethel's reckless actions. Although Lynn himself didn't read that knowledge, knowledge is still knowledge. Since it passed through Mr. Bubble's hands, he could naturally use it, even in a physical sense. Of course, the only downside to this method is that it causes significant harm to the individual. While removing corruption, it also damages the corrupted part of the person's spirit. Although it doesn't completely destroy it, there are indeed some side effects. So Lynn would only use this method to remove shallow corruption. The resulting side effects would just require the individual to rest for a while. If conditions allowed, adding a few healing skills would ensure that the impact wouldn't be too severe. But for deep corruption, like the state Rissel was in after ascending to the moon, the result of using this method would only lead to one outcome: Rissel's spirit would explode along with the corruption. Even if some remained, he would become an idiot. You're not trying to kill me, are you? Rissel, after groaning for a while, finally recovered, got up from the ground, and weakly looked at Lynn. If I wanted to kill you, I wouldn't need to do this. Lynn spoke honestly, then, in a rare show of conscience, cast several healing skills on Rissel. As Rissel's pale face regained color, Lynn explained, "You should trust my integrity. Even if you don't trust me, believe that I wouldn't waste a good 24/7 employee like you. Although it's my first time using this method, I can at least guarantee your safety." Lynn wasn't lying. Though he wasn't sure at first if the method to remove corruption would work on the mother goddess of depravity's corruption, he had controlled his power enough to ensure that even if it couldn't cleanse Rissel, it wouldn't cause irreversible damage. After all, if Rissel died, who would work for him in the future? Lynn had no desire to run the entire church by himself. That would make him a complete wage slave. Not to mention, he was still counting on Rissel to push the world's technological development. Even if the outer gods were lurking, there would come a time when they would be eliminated. And, even for being beneath the earth, people might find a way to put it to eternal rest. Technology still had to advance. It was just a matter of time. Upon hearing Lynn's brutally honest words, Rissel's mouth twitched. He couldn't help but ask, "So, my future self sold me out, huh?" "Yeah." Lynn nodded, looking at Rissel. "Future you promised that if I could save you, you'd work for me. 24/7 shift." Rissel's voice trembled. Whether from anger, shock, or both, it was unclear. Of course. What else? Angels don't need sleep, and they won't die from overwork, Lynn replied as if it were the most natural thing in the world. His expression seemed to say, do you have a problem with that? Russell had a big problem. He even had the urge to smash his future self's head in with a rock. After holding back for a long time, he finally tried to grit out a sentence, but came out blank. What kind of black-hearted boss is this? No, even the most exploitative capitalists aren't this cruel. Ha ha ha. Lynn laughed and patted Russell on the shoulder. Just kidding. I wouldn't really make you work 24/7. I'm a proper boss. Russell breathed a sigh of relief, but before he could fully relax, Lynn continued, as long as you help me manage the Church of Steam and Machinery, you can take as much vacation time as you want. Russell's mouth twitched again. At that moment, countless curses welled up inside him, but all he could say was, so, you're saying that if I can find someone reliable to work for me, I can hand off my duties. Clearly, Russell's mind was sharp, as always. As long as the person you choose is reliable, I have no objections. Lynn nodded indifferently, making it clear that he didn't care who got the work done, as long as it was done well. After all, finding someone to cover your shifts was a skill in itself. Russell finally exhaled in relief. His eyes darted around, clearly coming up with some mischievous ideas. However, a new concern soon came to mind. He gave Lynn a peculiar look and asked, so, when you said you were going to ambush the god of steam and machinery, you weren't joking. Why would you think I was joking? Lynn looked at him, genuinely puzzled. Because everything about that statement sounded like a joke. Russell couldn't help but mentally gripe, then asked, do you have a grudge against him? Not exactly. Lynn shook his head, rubbing his chin thoughtfully. But since I want to become the demon of knowledge, and I need a church under my control, I don't want to build one from scratch. So, I'll just take over an existing one. Russell didn't know what to say, silently pitying the god of steam and machinery. What kind of bad luck does he have? Trouble just fell on him from the sky. Still, after some thought, Russell couldn't help but ask, what are you going to do with the god of steam and machinery? Though his relationship with God had strained after the Bonneva incident, Russell had been under artisan care for many years. He couldn't be entirely indifferent to his fate. Are you worried I'll kill him? Lynn, noticing Russell's concern, laughed and replied. Russell froze for a second, then quickly shook his head. Don't start rumors. I don't have any care for him. Seeing Russell's eagerness to distance himself from Artisan, Lynn raised an eyebrow, briefly sympathizing with Artisan in his heart. Look at this guy being a tsundere. Smiling at Russell, Lynn continued, don't worry. Artisan, like you, is my employee. Even though he's not officially working for me yet, I'm a kind boss. I won't do anything to him. So, you two might end up being colleagues. End of chapter. How many steps are there to trapping the god of steam and machinery in a sack? The answer is 3 steps. First, prepare a sack in Artisan's favorite color and get Russell, his favored trader, to help. Second, have Russell act as bait to knock on the doors of Artisan's divine kingdom, then sneak in with him. Third, beat Artisan senseless, knock him out, and put the sack over him. This was Lynn's plan to capture Artisan. It was simple, brutal, and, without a doubt, had a high success rate. Unfortunately, the plan got stuck on the 3rd step. The moment the god of steam and machinery saw Lynn following behind Russell, pretending to be a bystander as they entered the divine kingdom, his expression changed dramatically in the span of 3 seconds, from shock, to anger, and then to hesitation. In the end, Artisan didn't hesitate for even a second before dropping to his knees and sliding on the ground. His eyes even welled up with tears, as if he was about to cry from excitement, and shouted. Master Lynn, I've waited so long for you. Russell. Lynn. What? So, Lynn was telling the truth. Artisan, no, the god of steam and machinery really is his follower. Russell found this world more absurd by the second. Of course, he had doubts about Lynn's strength. Even though Lynn completely overpowered him when they first met and easily removed the corruption of the mother goddess of depravity, Russell still couldn't fully believe it. After all, Russell was only a Sequence 2 knowledge magister at the moment. This was powerful among ordinary Beyonders, but when facing the King of Angels or a Sequence 0, it wasn't even close. Being killed in an instant wouldn't be surprising. Moreover, though Russell knew about the outer gods, he didn't fully understand their power. Because of that, he hadn't grasped how extraordinary it was for Lynn to easily remove the corruption. While Russell's black history made him somewhat believe in Lynn's strength, he remained skeptical about Lynn's claims, especially the one about beating the eternal blazing sun to a pulp. The reason Russell agreed so quickly to help Lynn break into the god of steam and machinery's divine kingdom was partly to see if Lynn was really as strong as he claimed. After all, Russell had the pride of a Shenxia protagonist and wouldn't easily submit to anyone, let alone work a 24/7 job for someone. But no matter how many schemes he had before, seeing the god of steam and machinery slide to his knees extinguished all of Russell's thoughts. He had clearly seen the changes in Artisan's expression and understood that his situation was probably the same as his own. Angry. Unwilling to be someone's subordinate, but too weak to fight back, so he had to accept it. If even the Sequence Zero Paragon acted this way, it was likely that Lynn's claim about beating the eternal blazing sun was true. Though Russell, as a transmigrator, was not one to easily accept fate, at that moment, he couldn't help but feel a sense of helplessness. He even began to ponder a crucial question: who could he get to cover for him at work? First, his replacement had to be powerful enough. If they were too weak, they wouldn't be able to keep the steam church in line, let alone handle high-level affairs. This world was not one lacking in danger. As the leader of a large church, strength was essential, or they could be killed by a dangerous Beyonder or sealed artifact at any moment. Alternatively, even if their strength was a bit lower, their status had to be special. They needed to be a god's favored one so that, when things got tough, they could call for backup. Additionally, they had to be capable enough to manage a church without causing chaos. Lastly, they had to be loyal. Otherwise, it wouldn't be covering, but taking over. Although Russell had previously harbored the idea of breaking away from the god of steam and machinery's church, especially after the Bonneva incident, now that Artisan had surrendered to Lynn and the church would likely be under Lynn's control, Russell owed Lynn a life debt. Russell was very aware that no matter what else Lynn said, the part about the outer gods was true. By stopping Russell from heading to the cosmos, Lynn had saved his life. In this situation, Russell knew that for the time being, he couldn't break away from the church. He would have to stay and work under Lynn. However, there were different levels of work. Russell didn't mind working for Lynn or even experiencing what it felt like to be a pope, but he definitely didn't want to be completely sidelined by someone he promoted himself. Given Lynn's display of capitalist tendencies, Russell had no doubt that if the person he promoted lacked loyalty, they might eventually take over, leaving him powerless. And could Russell tolerate that? Absolutely not. Speaking of which, Vern and the others aren't that young anymore. Maybe you could try grooming them for the role. Just as Russell was pondering potential candidates among his loyal followers, Lynn suddenly spoke, catching him off guard. Russell immediately became alert and stared at Lynn, asking, "Are you familiar with Bernadette?" His expression made it clear he thought Lynn might have ulterior motives. Lynn glanced at him and easily guessed what he was thinking. With a teasing smile, Lynn drew out his response, "Well, I wouldn't say we're close, but her soul does often come into my dreams." That wasn't wrong. Bernadette and Russell indeed met in his dream space every few days. And not just them, Mr. Dorr was also in the dream space every day, tutoring Klein. Though this was all perfectly innocent, Lynn's vague words caused Russell to widen his eyes, mentally translating Lynn's statement to, "We meet in dreams every day." As for why they could only meet in dreams and not in reality. Given Lynn's strength, which was at least on par with a Sequence Zero, and considering the god of steam and machinery couldn't leave his divine kingdom or even issue divine decrees often, Russell felt like he understood. This pained him greatly. Not only did he feel like his precious daughter had been stolen, but he also asked in a broken voice, "Lynn. You married her." End of chapter. If you're asking about Bernadette. She'll have a daughter in the future, Lynn said with a smile, pretending not to notice Russell's question fully. A daughter. Russell took a deep breath, feeling a mix of emotions like a tipped-over spice bottle. He subconsciously began to examine Lynn, frowning afterward. There was no denying Lin's strength, otherwise, the god of steam and machinery wouldn't have kneeled before him. But it was clear Lynn wasn't a suitable match. He didn't seem like the mature and steady type, more like a capitalist with possibly some sadistic tendencies. To be honest, Russell didn't think having an overly powerful partner was a good thing. While a strong partner could protect Bernadette, it also meant that if he turned out to be a scumbag, his daughter would have no way to resist. And Lynn, in front of him, clearly wasn't a good guy. At this moment, Russell had already put on his judgmental glasses. Everything about Lynn rubbed him the wrong way. Ha ha ha. Before Russell could finish nitpicking in his mind, Lynn suddenly burst into laughter. This left Russell bewildered. He saw Lynn wiping the corners of his eyes. You don't think I have any sort of relationship with your daughter, do you? Lynn, who had deliberately misled Russell, wiped away his tears and innocently said, "Don't be ridiculous. She visits my dreams just to see you. In the future, you'll suffer severe corruption, and Bernadette can only meet you in my dreams to avoid being affected." Russell was taken aback, his eyes widening in realization. He glared at Lynn, his face flushing with a mix of anger and confusion, before finally asking, "So, what's the deal with the daughter?" "Bernadette does indeed have a daughter in the future, but it has nothing to do with me. And that daughter isn't even her biological child, she's adopted," Lynn explained, pausing for a moment before glancing at Russell. "Because of the corruption, you do a lot of terrible things in the future, leading to a falling out with Bernadette. But even so, after your death, she spends 150 years searching for you, with no time for romance." Russell froze upon hearing this, his expression becoming more complex. After a few seconds, he sighed, "That child. Sigh, since we've fallen out, she shouldn't care whether I live or die. Why search for me for 150 years? Although he hadn't experienced that future, from Lynn's brief description, Russell could already imagine how difficult those 150 years must have been for Bernadette. As a self-admitted doting father, Russell would rather Bernadette disown him and start a new life, instead of tormenting herself like this. "Aren't you concerned about your future death?" Lynn asked after waiting patiently for a few moments, once Russell's emotions seemed to calm down. "It's not that I'm unconcerned, but it's not surprising. If I really get corrupted, then such an end wouldn't be unexpected," Russell replied, having already guessed something. He continued, "But since I can still meet you afterward and entrust you with saving me, it seems I didn't truly die, right? Your death is indeed part of your plan. You intended to use death to escape the corruption. Unfortunately, the corruption from the mother goddess of depravity was more persistent than you expected. So, even though you died once, you still couldn't escape being her plaything." Lynn nodded, not hiding the truth. "Tisk, I really am unlucky." Russell clicked his tongue, but he didn't seem too surprised. He then looked at Lynn again and said, "But I guess it's not all bad." "Hey." Lynn understood what he meant and chuckled. Suddenly, he remarked, "You're taking this better than I expected. I thought someone with your personality would resist me more. Usually, overpowered protagonists don't like having others above them. Who would like that?" Russell retorted, giving Lynn a sideways glance before looking at the quiet artisan standing nearby, saying nothing. "It isn't like I don't want to resist. No, it's that I couldn't resist." Besides, Russell wasn't some invincible protagonist who became a god or angel right after transmigrating. He had worked his way up from an ordinary person. Working for someone wasn't new to him. He had worked for the Steam Church before, and now he'd simply change employers. No big deal, he'd continue to grow stronger while working. Russell was practical in this regard and didn't have any irrational pride about not working for others. "You're more realistic than I expected," Lynn commented. Suddenly remembering something, he asked, "By the way, Russell, do you now realize that this world is Earth?" Lynn said this in Chinese on purpose. He knew that in the original story, it wasn't until after Russell had been to the moon that he fully confirmed this world as Earth, at which point he became determined to protect it with his life. It was also when he started genuinely caring for more than just a few people like Bernadette, no longer treating life as a game. Lynn wanted to break the news early. First, he believed it was better to face harsh truths sooner rather than later. Second, he wanted Russell to take his work seriously. Lynn could tell that Russell wasn't particularly eager to work for him right now, which was understandable. At this point in time, Russell was at his peak, with full confidence and an unbeaten streak, save for one setback in Bonneva. Someone like that might acknowledge Lynn's life-saving favor and reluctantly choose to work for him, but their heart wouldn't fully be in it. Later era Russell, after enduring the beatings from outer gods, was much more grounded. At that point, his only goal was to escape corruption and protect Bernadette in the face of the apocalypse. Though he complained outwardly about working for Lynn, deep down, he was more than willing. While Lynn told Russell he could have someone else fill in for him, he still relied on Russell to push forward with technological advancements. Hence, he didn't want this genius plagiarizer to slack off. That's why he intended to motivate Russell with the truth about their world and the promise of a grand future. After all, rescuing one person or two didn't make much difference to Lynn. He had already promised Amonises and Klein to save their family. End of chapter. It turned out that Lynn's approach was correct. After learning the truth about crossing over and confirming that this place was indeed Earth, Russell, though initially dejected and grieving, did not collapse entirely. On the contrary, there was a hint of relief on his face, as if he had long suspected this but now finally had confirmation. In this situation, Lynn seized the moment and revealed to Russell that he could potentially rescue Russell's family in the future. Are you serious? Russell's expression was unprecedentedly serious, tinged with disbelief and a bit of joy. Clearly, Russell cared deeply for his family and friends from the previous era. I'm standing in front of you, isn't that the best proof? Lynn didn't explain much and simply smiled. Russell froze for a moment and quickly realized. Indeed, if Lynn truly existed in multiple timelines as he claimed, then rescuing Russell's family from the previous era wouldn't be too difficult for him. Russell didn't expect Lynn to be able to prevent the destruction of the previous era, but just like he himself had managed to survive by sleeping through time and appearing in this era, if the right method were found, he had no doubt his family could also reappear in this time. What do I need to give in return? After realizing this, Russell took a deep breath and looked at Lynn. As an adult, Russell didn't believe in free lunches, especially from someone like Lynn, who didn't appear to be the type to offer charity. You don't need to give much. Or rather, working for me is what you'll need to do. Lynn shook his head and said, I treat my employees well, you should believe that. Russell bit his lip instinctively at these words, understanding the implicit meaning behind Lynn's statement. He would save Russell's family because Russell worked for him, but if Russell was no longer his employee, there would be no family saving. Given Lynn's unique abilities, there was no loophole to exploit in this deal. Russell could betray him after his family was rescued, but Lynn, who could traverse time and space, could undo that rescue just as easily. You really are a black-hearted capitalist. Russell muttered in near complaint, sighing deeply as if lamenting his fate, but then smiled. Just to confirm, if I find someone to take over my duties, I won't need to work 24/7, right? Of course. Lynn nodded, adding, but you should be prepared. I'm counting on you to push the tech tree forward. If you can find enough talent to replace you, I wouldn't mind giving you a vacation. Same old job. Russell couldn't help but complain, but didn't really reject the idea. After all, pushing technological progress was how he rose to power in the first place. Continuing the same work didn't seem so bad. Thinking about it, working for him isn't too bad after all. At least he is powerful enough to protect the church, and being its bishop wouldn't tarnish my reputation. Russell considered the benefits and soon found himself warming up to the idea of working for Lynn. Of course, the biggest factor was that Russell couldn't resist the temptation of saving his family, making it impossible for him to refuse Lynn's offer. And besides, Russell glanced at Artisan beside him and suddenly felt more at peace. Even his former boss was now working for Lynn. What right did he have to complain? While Lynn was handling Russell, he finally turned his attention to Artisan, who had been quietly sitting on the side. The moment Lynn looked at him, Artisan handed over a document, saying, "This is a list of the high-ranking members of the church and a catalog of resources." Obviously, Artisan hadn't just been sitting idly by, he had been diligently compiling information. He was acting quite obediently. Oh. Lynn took the document, raised an eyebrow, and couldn't help but laugh at Artisan's submissive behavior. Thank you for your hard work, Artisan. It was no trouble at all, just doing my job, Artisan quickly replied, his attitude as fawning as could be. It wasn't entirely his fault for being so subservient. Artisan had just received all the memory fragments about Lynn's recent activities, including witnessing him defeat the eternal blazing sun, hearing stories from Mr. Door, and learning about Lynn's overwhelming power. Artisan, never one to hold on to pride, had no issue being submissive. He was already convinced that Lynn was not someone to be trifled with. After all, back in the fourth epoch, he had learned this lesson the hard way. You simply can't beat him. So, though Artisan felt some lingering attachment to his Sequence Zero position, he knew that working for Lynn was his best option to stay safe. Plus, compared to facing the outer gods in the apocalypse, clinging to such a powerful figure who could fight back seemed like the best course of action. As Lynn quickly scanned the documents Artisan had handed him, he gained a clearer understanding of the current state of the Church of Steam and Machinery. Although the church had grown significantly under Russell's leadership, it still lacked some of the deeper foundations necessary to match the power of the other major churches, particularly in terms of sealed artifacts. However, Lynn didn't see this as a significant issue. After reviewing the document, he looked back at Artisan and said, sometime soon, I'll likely advance to Illuminator and perhaps even take full control of the Paragon's uniqueness. When that happens, you'll probably lose yours. End of chapter. Lynn spoke the truth. In the fourth epoch, thanks to the smooth progress in the construction of the true Creator Church, mainly because the main framework had already been built, he even managed to deceive Pallas into fully supporting him. For him, filling in the rest of the church wasn't that difficult. It's amusing, half of the Zoroast family members have already been tricked into joining the true Creator Church. Every time Solomon sees him, his expression turns dark. But would Lynn say that? Unfortunately, there's no medicine for regret in this world, at least not for others. So, even though Solomon is pained, thinking that he shouldn't have let the Zoroast family get involved with Lynn and feels like he's sending lambs into the wolf's mouth, it's already too late. In short, with most of the Zoroast family on board, Artisan feeling a sense of crisis and performing exceptionally well, and Azek diligently handling most of the administrative work for the church, Lynn has managed to fill up the true Creator Church by more than half. Although the faith in the true Creator among the church members wasn't devout enough, and the lack of time meant there hadn't been enough promotion of the true Creator's teachings, the true Creator was in a better state than before, though still not fully awake. Still, Lynn managed to extend his influence into every corner of the Solomon Empire, nearly completing his ceremony for becoming an Illuminator. In just a few days, he could take the final steps and ascend. What about the progress on digesting the Knowledge Magister potion? Of course, Lynn discovered that the potion was fully digested after he woke from his slumber. The existence of the Eye of Secrets is far more suited to the role of Knowledge Magister than a sage. Lynn had already begun promoting various technologies that benefit the people in the Solomon Empire, such as the steam engine, helping him digest the Illuminator potion ahead of time, thanks to Russell's contributions, allowing Lynn to directly transplant them. Lynn wasn't expecting the Illuminator potion to digest as smoothly as the Knowledge Emperor's potion. After all, the Illuminator is more accurately termed the Civilization Illuminator, focusing on advancing civilization. While related to knowledge, the focus of digestion differs from that of the Knowledge Emperor. So even though Lynn is the Lord of Knowledge, it's unlikely he can instantly digest this potion, just as he had to slowly digest the Sage and Knowledge Magister potions. But, maybe not, Lynn mused with a subtle expression. Even though my special status may not help with the Illuminator potion, in the end, being an Illuminator means advancing civilization, whether by bringing primitive people into the agricultural age or sparking the Industrial Revolution. Either way, it counts as fulfilling civilization's illumination. In the fourth epoch, Lynn may have only begun this process, but his organization, the Eye of Secrets, had already made significant strides in the second epoch. The Eye of Secrets controlled the education system and it had over the past 100 years been responsible for teaching batches of slaves from various Beyonder species, turning them into free citizens. Under the guidance of the Eye of Secrets, these people learned to fight and farm, thus completing the transformation from a primitive slave society to an agricultural age. Though this wasn't entirely the work of the Eye of Secrets, just as Artisan could digest the Illuminator potion thanks to Russell, Lynn could theoretically share in this success and digest the potion himself. So, am I about to instantly digest it again? Lynn thought, amused by the idea. He couldn't help but feel that his past self, who chose to establish the Eye of Secrets, was far too foresighted. Once Lynn digests the Illuminator potion, he can fully absorb the uniqueness of the Paragon. This uniqueness corresponds to knowledge, even if it's knowledge of the material world, making it something he can absorb perfectly. With that, I'll be very close to becoming the demon of knowledge. The only things left are ensuring Klein's advancement and figuring out how to save people. I've already rescued Russell. Isaac just needs to wait for the right moment, and Mr. Door doesn't require much effort anymore. I'll just take him on a tour of the cosmos. Among those remaining, the most important are, of course, Medici and Saussure. Lynn pondered, resisting the urge to stretch lazily. Medici has already been halfway rescued. He only needs to successfully ascend to Red Priest in the fourth epoch. Now that I think about it, Medici might not need to wait for the Pale Calamity to advance to Red Priest. I nearly forgot, the War of the Four Emperors was a continent-spanning conflict. Lynn chuckled. In theory, as long as Medici wins in the War of the Four Emperors, this massive war, involving numerous Sequence 0s and spanning 2 continents, would fully support his ascension to Red Priest. Considering the successful construction of the True Creator Church in the Fourth Epoch, and the members of the Aurora Order I've sent for training, Saussure's recovery should just be a matter of time. Lynn recalled his identities in the Second Epoch, always ready for a return, and couldn't help but purse his lips. He realized that avatars who have absorbed uniqueness can indeed return at any time, but once returned, separating them again may not be easy. In other words, when he ascends to Sequence 0, it might be time to temporarily say goodbye to the friends and family from various eras. As for when he could reunite with them by splitting off another avatar, it would depend on whether he can successfully detach from his main body and become fully independent. Once Lynn attains true freedom, he could create new identities and visit his friends once more. Lynn was confident that this day wasn't far off. They would meet again, no matter the time or space. Of course, in addition to these friends and family, Lynn hadn't forgotten about helping Klein retrieve his relatives from the pre-epoch, or assisting Bernadette in rescuing her sister. Lynn had always been someone who kept his promises. Naturally, Artisan was unaware of all the thoughts Lynn had in just a few seconds. His breathing hitched for a moment, clearly unsettled by the fact that his characteristic would disappear soon. But Artisan was someone who understood reality well, so after a brief pause, he simply said, "That's how it should be." Seeing Artisan's willingness to submit, Lynn was quite satisfied and added, "For now, we don't need to announce my replacement of you publicly. We have enough time to take this slowly." Directly announcing the replacement of a church's god would cause great upheaval, so Lynn chose to use Artisan's identity, just like how the Fool had used Sea God's identity before slowly layering other disguises to complete the transition. After all, he wasn't in any hurry, there was plenty of time in this era. End of chapter. During the Russell era, Lynn successfully acquired Artisan as assistant. With his help, Lynn began taking control of the Church of Steam and Machinery. Meanwhile, in the fifth epoch, thanks to Catalya's relentless efforts, the future finally arrived at the sea where the mermaids resided. It was truly a cause for celebration. Unlike the mermaids from fairy tales, the mermaids in this mysterious world were not only beautiful but also undeniably dangerous. However, when they noticed Klein approaching in a small boat, they panicked and fled in fear, as if they had already sensed the danger posed by Mr. Fool. Had it been anyone else, they might have been at a loss, but fortunately, Klein possessed the sea god's scepter. Having crafted many charms from the storm pathway, he quickly used one of these charms to calm the fleeing mermaids. With their song guiding him, Klein successfully consumed the marionettist potion. "I've finally reached Sequence 5, Klein remarked, opening his eyes after his successful promotion to marionettist. As he stretched his body, he couldn't help but let out a sigh. "Do you really have the right to say that?" It took you less than half a year to go from an ordinary person to Sequence 5. Lynn, who was sitting next to him in the small boat, couldn't resist teasing him. Such a sigh would surely make other Beyonders, who spent decades climbing to Sequence 5, envious. Klein glanced at Lynn and replied coolly, "What right do you have to criticize me?" Truth be told, Lynn's promotion speed was even more outrageous than his own. Of course, it's different. I'm a Smurf account, having already maxed out my main account. You're the one who started from scratch, Lynn scoffed, not bothering to hide his sense of superiority. Klein rolled his eyes and decided to ignore him, instead focusing on familiarizing himself with the marionettist's abilities. As the name implies, the marionettist potion granted Klein the power to control the spiritual threads within every person. By manipulating these threads, Klein could directly control a person's body by influencing their spirit. In theory, as long as Klein had enough time and wasn't interrupted, he could turn anyone into his marionette. However, he could only control one person at the moment. If he wanted a new marionette, he would have to give up the previous one. Even after digesting the marionettist potion, he would only be able to control up to 3 marionettes. Marionettes retained their abilities as Beyonders, meaning a skilled marionettist was incredibly dangerous. Fighting one would essentially mean facing 4 opponents at once. However, despite their impressive control abilities, marionnettists shared the same physical vulnerabilities as seers. If they lost their marionettes and were forced to fight directly, they could easily be killed. One could look to the infamous Rosago for an example. He went into battle without a marionette and was promptly defeated, becoming the laughingstock of history. If only Rosago hadn't been so reckless, if he hadn't been mesmerized by Sharon, his wraith marionette, and instead had waited and gathered more marionettes in secret, he wouldn't have met such a ridiculous end. Alright, now that you've successfully become a marionettist, have you thought about the choice I mentioned earlier? Lynn asked suddenly after waiting patiently for Klein to familiarize himself with his new abilities. Ahem, Klein nearly choked on his own spit. He hesitated for a moment and then glanced at Lynn, still uncertain. Do I really need to decide so soon? I just got promoted, and I still need time to digest the potion. It's not too soon. According to his plan, you're supposed to become a demigod by the end of this year. If you miss that opportunity, it'll be much harder to find another demigod to hunt, Lynn said, smiling as he casually dropped a bombshell. Klein was stunned. He stared at Lynn in disbelief. What's wrong with the Angel of Secrets? There's only a little over a month left until the end of the year. Are you seriously suggesting I digest the Sequence 5 potion in just over a month? Don't forget about time travel. A little over a month in our world is enough time for several trips. Even if each trip only lasts a couple of months, in total, that could add up to a year and a half. With your potion digestion speed, a year and a half should be plenty, Lynn replied with a smile. Klein was momentarily speechless but had to admit that Lynn had a point. If he only had a month, digesting the Sequence 5 potion would be challenging. However, with time travel factored in, it was possible. He quickly turned his attention to another question. What do you mean by, find a demigod for me to hunt? Are you serious? As someone who had orchestrated numerous schemes, interacted with powerful forces, and received instruction from Mr. Door, Klein knew full well the immense gap between Sequence 5 and a demigod. Even a newly promoted Sequence 4 could easily crush a Sequence 5. This gap was nearly impossible to bridge, even with the help of sealed artifacts or mystical items. No matter how powerful the items were, they could never match the complete control a demigod had over their pathway. Moreover, using sealed artifacts required a great deal of spirituality, and it wasn't as simple as just wielding a high-level item. Well, as ridiculous as it sounds, the ritual for the Bizarro Sorcerer requires a Beyonder to publicly assassinate a Sequence 4. Lynn spread his hands and gave Klein a sympathetic look. I'd love to help you change the ritual, but that's beyond my capabilities. Klein's expression turned blank as he struggled to process the information. After a few moments, he snapped out of it and gave Lynn a suspicious look. How do you even know the Bizarro Sorcerer's ritual? Because that guy's memories have it all, Lynn replied nonchalantly before flashing Klein a bright smile. By the way, you guessed correctly, I also know the formula for the Bizarro Sorcerer potion, but. Lynn blinked innocently and continued with a grin. There's no free lunch in this world. My price is either a collection of cat pictures or £5,000. Of course, I'd recommend the cat pictures. It's not like you'd lose anything, just turn into a cat and pose for a few photos. It's not embarrassing at all. And they'd be cat pictures, not your true form, so what's the harm? Lynn reasoned shamelessly. Before Klein could retort, he added, if you're really embarrassed about doing it alone, I could join in. How about I turn into a husky? Klein. End of chapter. In that moment, Klein wasn't sure whether he should praise Lynn or curse him. Gritting his teeth, he responded after a few seconds, fine, let's go with the husky. It was just some pet photo shoots, after all, he could take them. However, if he had to embarrass himself, he would never do it alone. Lynn was taken aback for a moment but didn't show any awkwardness or hesitation. Instead, a look of excitement appeared on his face as he exclaimed, you agreed. Great, it's settled then. You bring the cat, I'll bring the dog, and we'll make a cat-dog duo. Clearly, Lynn wasn't the least bit shy about taking dog photos. After all, Lynn's sense of shame had been lost long ago, around 800 years in the past, thanks to a certain Nyarla incident. Although he couldn't remember what had happened, the sense of shame hadn't grown back either. Asterisk. Seeing Lynn's enthusiastic expression, Klein regretted his decision for a brief second. But before he could dwell on it too long, Lynn seemed to recall something and said, oh, by the way, I just received some news, Russell has successfully removed the corruption. What? The explosive news caught Klein off guard. He looked at Lynn, both puzzled and pleasantly surprised. But wasn't that supposed to wait until the time travel? Plans couldn't keep up with changes. Someone arrived in Russell's timeline and altered the situation. That's how the corruption was removed, Lynn explained. He then turned to Klein, although we can't go there right now, we can talk to Russell through the dream space. Want to join? Klein thought for a moment and then nodded without hesitation, I'd like to meet him. As a fellow transmigrator, Klein was genuinely concerned about Russell. So, aboard the future, Catalya watched in astonishment as the two guests, after advancing using the Song of the Mermaid, rushed back to the ship, only to retreat to their respective cabins to sleep. Catalya, who had planned to offer congratulations and inquire about their next steps. What just happened? Why are they going to sleep? Catalya was confused but also somewhat relieved. In the past 3 days, thanks to the advice and funding of the two guests, Frank had gone above and beyond, creating a batch of strange objects. When they passed through a sea region imbued with the Earth Mother's residual power, the future even began producing milk, unlocking a new, sunshine radiance, fashion set that nearly blinded everyone on board, making Catalya feel as though she'd lived a lifetime's worth of excitement in just a few days. So, to her, the guests choosing rest over more mischief was a blessing. Her nerves couldn't take much more. Captain, since Mr. Gabriel and Mr. Gehrman have accomplished their goals, should we part ways with them? The second mate asked quietly, his voice full of hope after spending the past 3 days experiencing an unprecedented level of chaos. He really didn't want to see Mr. Gabriel heading to Frank's lab to give him more ideas. And he absolutely didn't want to wake up one day with a mushroom growing on his head or find that his succulents had sprouted mouths and started singing. It was terrifying. Catalya hesitated for a few seconds, then nodded. In the dream space, after pulling in everyone involved, including Russell, the Angel of Secrets smiled and congratulated him. Congratulations, Russell. From today onward, you are no longer a plaything of the Mother Goddess of Depravity. Thanks to you, Russell scratched his head, unable to hide his joy. He was genuinely ecstatic, never expecting salvation to arrive so suddenly. Although Lynn had once teased him in the past, Russell clearly didn't care about such minor matters anymore. Hearing this, Bernadette also beamed with joy. She had been diligently watching over the Augustus royal family in Backland when she was suddenly pulled into the dream space by the Angel of Secrets, and now this incredible news had landed in her lap. Klein, too, couldn't help but smile, pleased that Russell had rid himself of the corruption. I thought you'd resurrect immediately after purging the corruption. I didn't expect you to restrain yourself, the Angel of Secrets said with a smile as he looked at Russell's beaming face. I did want to resurrect immediately, but that probably wouldn't have fit your plans, right? Russell turned to the Angel of Secrets. I don't know what you're up to, but with your mischievous tendencies, I'm sure you want to give the Augustus family a big surprise. If I resurrected too early and messed up your plan, I'd probably end up being the one who suffers. Clearly, despite their short time together, Russell had already developed a deep understanding of someone's penchant for mischief and had no intention of becoming the butt of their jokes again. It seems you've gotten to know me well. The Angel of Secrets nodded, rather pleased with Russell's observation. Then, with a smile, he said, I do indeed want you to give the Augustus family a surprise. Say, at the end of the year, when they plan to use the Great Smog incident to kill tens of thousands of people and cover up the missing population, wouldn't it be delightful if the Black Emperor returned? Russell raised an eyebrow. It seems you really hold a grudge against them. Well, they've certainly earned it, the Angel of Secrets chuckled. So, can you do it? Of course. Russell nodded confidently, his eyes darkening with determination. Even if you didn't ask, I'd still do it. The new Black Emperor, they wanted me dead. Russell and the Augustus family had a deep-rooted enmity, after all. However, Russell hadn't forgotten another matter. He turned to Lynn and said, but now that I've been saved, about your plan, Lynn. 0 inches now that we've dealt with the serious business, I'll leave you to your father-daughter bonding, the Angel of Secrets interrupted with a smile, then glanced at Klein. It's time for us three to discuss our own matters. Russell's expression darkened instantly, realizing that even though he'd been saved, his past was still likely to be used for someone else's amusement. Sigh. Oh well, at least there's always someone worse off. I'm concerned for him. What did she do to him to remove his sense of shame permanently? End of chapter. The thing Lynn wanted to discuss with Klein was undoubtedly about the upcoming photo shoot of the cat-themed photos and the visit to an old friend. Naturally, this made Klein so embarrassed that he wished he could dig a hole and hide in it. To change the topic, he cleared his throat lightly and asked, who's the old friend you're referring to? You should have heard of their name. They were once known as a half-fool and were close colleagues with Bethel, the Angel of Secrets replied with a smile. That's Antigonus, isn't it? Klein paused for a moment, somewhat surprised. As a student of Mr. Dorr, Klein had already heard stories about Antigonus and learned more about him from Lynn's diary. However, Klein looked at Lynn doubtfully and asked uncertainly, but hasn't Antigonus already lost control? That was what Mr. Dorr had told Klein. Indeed, Antigonus has lost control and is now trapped in Foggy Town as a grotesque wolf insect by the Evernight goddess. The Angel of Secrets nodded and glanced at Klein with a smile. The Fool's uniqueness and Sequence 1 characteristics of the Fool pathway are still with him, and not only that, the blasphemy card of the Fool is also in his possession. So, don't feel like you're losing out. Trading a set of cat-themed photos for the blasphemy card of the Fool is a deal you couldn't find anywhere else, the Angel of Secrets said with a sigh at the end. Only I would make such a losing deal. Klein was stunned, feeling overwhelmed by the sudden information. He took a few seconds to process it before asking, still unsure, so, you want to take me to see Antigonus and retrieve the Fool's card? But, Antigonus has lost control. Are you saying you have a way to make him regain clarity and escape the state of madness? I don't have the ability to restore Antigonus to his former self, the Angel of Secrets replied while giving Klein a meaningful look, without explaining further. However, suppressing the maddened Antigonus is no big deal for me, so I can help you get the card. Also, the Angel of Secrets suddenly flashed a playful smile and looked at Klein. I plan to take you on a little hunt. Huh. Klein was genuinely puzzled this time. The image of an infamous comic scene popped into his mind, but he quickly shook his head to dispel it. After a few seconds of thought, he tentatively asked, you don't mean Zeratul, do you? Considering the connections between the Hunt and the Fool pathway, Klein could only think of Zeratul, the former head of the Secret Order and once a close associate of Russell. Exactly, it's him. The Angel of Secrets nodded with satisfaction, clapping for Klein's deduction skills. Then, smiling again, he added, he's currently in Foggy Town, half dead. Considering that he'll be your enemy in the future, I thought it'd be a good idea for you to get used to him by giving him a good beating. A big question mark almost visibly formed over Klein's head. He was speechless, not understanding what the Angel of Secrets was talking about. After a while, Klein finally found his voice again and hesitantly asked, "You want me to beat up a miracle invoker?" Was he serious? Klein was only sequence 5. His opponent wouldn't even need to move a muscle. Just displaying their mythical form would be enough to wipe him out. Even though Klein had always known the Angel of Secrets was outrageous, he felt this was going too far. In your current state, of course, you can't beat him. But don't worry, I can power you up. The Angel of Secrets laughed and looked at Klein before explaining, "I've developed a new move, similar to historical projection fusion, but this time, the projection isn't from the past. It borrows power from the future. Because of that, theoretically, after I enhance you with this buff, you'll be able to briefly use your future self's strength. Although it would only last around 10 seconds, it's more than enough to beat up Zeratul," the Angel of Secrets explained further. Lynn had indeed developed this new technique after advancing to King of Angels and gaining further mastery over his abilities. The essence of the move was still rooted in Lynn's ability to create alternate accounts across different timelines. The historical projection summoned wasn't from the timeline Lynn had interfered with, but from a timeline where he hadn't. In fact, Lynn had begun to sense that, due to his interference, history seemed to split into two layers. One was the new, evolving history that hadn't yet reached its end, and the other was the original history, unchanged and flowing as it was intended. Though the altered history should theoretically overwrite the original timeline hadn't truly disappeared. It had fused with the new one, existing in a Schrödinger-like state. Others couldn't see the dual-layered history, only its merged form. But to Lynn, both versions still existed, one is the past, and one is the future. This realization had inspired Lynn to develop a skill that allowed others to borrow power from their future selves, as the future had, in a way, already become the past. Of course, this technique only worked for others, not for Lynn himself, as he didn't have a corresponding version of himself in the old timeline. But for Klein, it was perfect. Holy crap. Even Klein couldn't help but exclaim in shock. He looked at Lynn incredulously and asked, "So, I can use the power of my future sequence 1 self?" He didn't mention sequence 0 because he remembered Mr. Dorr mentioning that ancient scholars couldn't summon the projection of someone who had absorbed a uniqueness. They could only borrow power through clever methods, like summoning a demigod projection of the Red Angel core, which could still channel the power of the War Angel and bypass the uniqueness restriction. The seers really had a knack for thinking outside the box. Exactly. The Angel of Secrets nodded and added, "However, I wouldn't recommend doing this when advancing to sequence 4. Since this involves cheating with my power, there's no guarantee it wouldn't affect the ceremony. Plus, hunting down a sequence 4 on your own would be a good experience." End of chapter. Even though borrowing my power likely won't affect the outcome of the ritual, I couldn't help but wonder. The Fool's Ascension ritual involves deceiving history, so if I take Klein on a journey through history, leaving behind his traces and turning the false ancient god who woke up to a true ancient god, wouldn't that count as deceiving history? Lynn couldn't help but ponder this. The main reason he didn't want Klein to rely on this cheat to hunt a sequence 4 Beander was, as he had said before, to ensure that Mr. Fool would gain enough experience. Taking down Zeratul ahead of schedule was one thing, as it was more of a sneak peek into the future, but this task, meant for Klein at his current stage, was something Lynn wouldn't assist with too much. After all, if Klein wanted to become the Lord of Mysteries, he couldn't be a sheltered flower. Klein wasn't disappointed by Lynn's words. Instead, he recalled something and asked, "But I'm only at sequence 5. If I fuse with the historical projection of myself from the future like this, wouldn't there be side effects?" Klein didn't think the Angel of Secrets would harm him, but the actions of a certain someone had always been so absurd that he couldn't help but be wary. Especially the fact that a sequence 5 could briefly borrow the power of a sequence 1, it sounded too much like a cheat. No matter how he thought about it, there had to be side effects. There are 2 side effects. First, after borrowing the power, you will experience a period of weakness for a few hours. It's not a big deal. A good sleep should fix it. Lynn didn't hide anything and continued to explain through the Angel of Secrets. Second, the Angel of Secrets paused here, looking at Klein with a somewhat subtle expression. You've already had some lessons with Bethel, so you should know that when pulling in a historical projection, if the person in question holds the relevant authority, they can project their consciousness into the historical projection. Klein was stunned for a moment, then immediately understood. He asked in disbelief, so, my future self could project consciousness into the historical projection? The Angel of Secrets smiled slightly and explained, this little trick was borrowed from my ability to communicate with different eras of myself, but it's not part of my core powers. So, your future self wouldn't really be able to project full consciousness and control the historical projection. At most, you might feel some emotions or the future self might gain a sense of things, like your memories, for example. But overall, it's still you, so there's no real loss. The Angel of Secrets winked at Klein. All in all, it's a rather interesting trick. Of course, Lynn wouldn't tell Klein that his original intention in developing this skill was to see if he could bypass the restrictions of his Smurf account and create alternative identities. Though it ultimately failed, in a way, it was still a success. Thanks to this ability, Lynn could communicate with future friends across different points in history. This was something the original Lynn couldn't do. Time travel required coordinates, and he didn't have any for future timelines. Plus, who knew when the next new identity slot would open? Even if he got a new slot, Lynn didn't plan to place his next identity in a future timeline but in another era altogether. After all, relying on Mr. Fool to ascend as the Lord of Mysteries would take a long time, and Lynn didn't want to rush his friend too much. So, he had a new idea. If he couldn't easily access the knowledge more in this timeline, why not go back to a time when the 9 Sephiroth, including the knowledge more, were first left behind after the Great Old One's awakening but before they were sealed by the Celestial Worthy. If Lynn opened a new identity in that era, wouldn't he be able to directly claim the knowledge more without waiting for the seal on the Western continent to be lifted? Can this really be called a little trick? Klein didn't know that a certain angelic friend was already planning how to bypass the seal of the Celestial Worthy to claim the knowledge more. Shocked by the Angel of Secrets' game-breaking ability, Klein couldn't help but voice his disbelief. Well, for me, it's just a little trick. The Angel of Secrets smiled faintly, then added, oh, right, the historical projection summoned by this trick isn't from any timeline I've interfered with, it's the original history. So when the time comes, try not to empathize too deeply. Otherwise, I'm afraid you might cry on the spot. A question mark slowly formed above Klein's head as he looked at the Angel of Secrets and asked, was I really that miserable? Well, if we're talking about strength, then no, you were certainly powerful. Future you is, without a doubt, the strongest on Earth. The Angel of Secrets' tone grew heavy as he looked at Klein with a sigh. But from a personal standpoint, the future you from that timeline, well, I could sum it up with one word: loneliness. Klein instinctively furrowed his brow and showed a thoughtful expression. He seemed to understand something. The Angel of Secrets didn't elaborate further. After patiently waiting a few seconds, he said, Foggy Town belongs to the Evernight Goddess, so before we visit, I'll need to notify Ammonizes first. Considering the time required to return from the Forsaken Land, I'll come to you in about 3 days. You'd better be mentally prepared. I will. Klein nodded seriously, then asked curiously, has your business there concluded? He knew that a few days ago, the Angel of Secrets and the Angel of War had left Silver City without a trace. Pretty much. I originally wanted to beat up Amon, but I've been too busy lately, so I'll let him off this time. The Angel of Secrets shrugged. Though his initial reason for visiting the Forsaken Land had been to deal with Amon, a series of unexpected events had made that goal less important. After helping Silver City explore the Temple of the True Creator and meeting the True Creator in person to confirm his improved condition, Lynn indeed planned to end his journey and return to Backland. Just in time, it was almost the moment to give the Augustus family a little surprise. Lynn could also nudge the Aurora Order into action and enjoy the spectacle of their performance. End of chapter.